to the debate. So imagine an industrial assembly line. You put raw materials in one end, the conveyor belt moves, the presses stamp, and the exact same product comes out the other side.
Right, yeah. Uniformity.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter if that factory is located in Beverly Hills or the South Bronx. It doesn't matter if it's a Tuesday or a Friday. The machine treats every single part equally.
Well, I mean, that is the whole point of mechanization, right? Reliability, predictability. We design systems precisely to eliminate that sort of arbitrary variation.
We do. But now look at the American criminal justice system. The very thing we literally call the machinery of justice.
Yeah, it's a telling phrase.
It really is, because if you feed two identical accusations into this machine, but one comes with a high-priced legal team and a wealthy family, and the other comes with, an overworked public defender and an empty bank account, the machine actually changes its gears.
It alters its operation.
Exactly. It alters its operation based on who is standing inside it. And that brings us to the foundational question we are exploring today. Does the American criminal justice system violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause by operating as an inherently unequal machinery?
Or conversely, does our current constitutional doctrine actually get it right when it defines and limits the scope of equal protection?
Right. And to navigate this, we are grounding our discussion entirely in Zachary David Enfield's pretty provocative essay, Process Before Protected, Equal Protection and the Unequal Machinery of American Justice.
Yeah, the essay definitely takes a hard swing at the status quo. But we have to look closely at whether that swing actually connects with the reality of constitutional law.
So, my position is that the constitutional promise of equal protection must be applied as a whole machine principle, meaning structural inequalities in bail, public defense, charging, and lawmaking represent a systemic constitutional failure.
And I maintain that current doctrine rightly limits equal protection to preventing arbitrary classification, and that what the essay calls unequal machinery are actually legitimate features of federalism, legislative discretion, and settled law.
Okay, so let's dive into the whole machine principle. To me, equal protection under the Constitution has to mean more than procedural paperwork. It can't just mean assigning a person a case number, a court date, and a lawyer's name on a piece of paper.
Well, the system does provide representation.
But the entire machinery standing between the accused and the weight of the state has to protect equally. Think about the Strickland standard, right? The Supreme Court's baseline for whether you received effective legal counsel.
Right, the objective unreasonableness test.
Exactly. The courts have essentially decided that as long as your lawyer is breathing and their mistakes weren't catastrophically, objectively unreasonable to the point of altering the case's outcome, well, the Sixth Amendment is satisfied.
Because you can't guarantee a flawless performance in every single trial.
But if a public defender has a caseload of 500 felonies a year and literally zero investigators, their signature on a form is not equal protection. Protection is the actual purpose of the amendment. Representation is just the method.
I hear what you're saying, but
I stand incredibly firm on this. Our current legal doctrine is morally and constitutionally inadequate. It treats a bare constitutional minimum as if it were equal justice, and it allows the poor to be processed before they are ever truly protected.
that is a powerful sentiment, I admit. But we have to look at what the Equal Protection Clause was actually designed to do, and what the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that it means over generations.
Which is a very narrow interpretation.
Well, equal protection has never been a positive guarantee of identical resources or identical outcomes. The doctrine operates as a shield against arbitrary, facially discriminatory classification, like race or religion.
But wealth plays a massive role.
It does, but look at the landmark case San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. The Supreme Court established very clearly there that wealth is not a suspect classification that triggers strict scrutiny.
Which is exactly the problem with the doctrine.
But that means a system producing different outcomes based on geography, local tax funding, or a defendant's private bank account is constitutionally permissible, provided the law itself doesn't explicitly discriminate. You are looking at a fundamentally unequal world where resources naturally vary, and mistaking that for an unequal protection violation.
I see why you rely on that formal legal definition, but I am absolutely not yielding that ground. Because those formal definitions are exactly how the system masks what is really happening on the ground.
How so?
Let's move out of the abstract doctrine and into the operational reality of how cases are actually resolved in this country. Let's look at the trial penalty, pretrial detention, and prosecutorial leverage.
Okay, let's talk about the reality of the process.
Because the reality is the machine processes and disposes of cases long before a jury ever sits in a box.
Well, prosecutorial discretion is the engine of the criminal justice system. Without it, the system just stops. And plea bargaining, which flows from that discretion, is completely constitutionally sound.
It's coercive.
We have to talk about Bordenkircher v. Hayes. The Supreme Court explicitly allowed prosecutors to use enhanced exposure as bargaining pressure. So a prosecutor can legally say, take this plea deal or I will hit you with a habitual offender charge.
Which is a threat.
The court called it a mutuality of advantage. The defendant secures a lighter, certain sentence, and the state saves the massive resources of a trial. And it's not the Wild West. We have safeguards, like the Boykin v. Alabama decision.
The Boykin colloquy.
Right. It ensures that any plea entered is knowing and voluntary. The judge literally looks the defendant in the eye and asks if they are being coerced. If the defendant says no, that is a constitutionally valid, mutually beneficial process.
I have to call out what you're doing there. You are relying on a judge's checklist to sanitize blatant coercion.
It's not a mere checklist, it's a sworn statement in open court.
But let's look at the actual facts of Bordenkircher, because they are staggering. Paul Hayes was accused of uttering a forged check for $88.30.
I know the case.
The prosecutor offered a 5-year plea deal. When Hayes did what the Constitution explicitly says he can do, asserted his Sixth Amendment right to a trial, the prosecutor followed through on a threat to re-indict him under the Habitual Criminal Act.
Because he had prior felony convictions.
And he received a mandatory life sentence. A 5-year plea versus a life sentence for an $88 check. That is not a mutuality of advantage. That is a constitutionally abhorrent punishment for having the audacity to exercise a fundamental right.
I will grant you that the facts in Bordenkircher are severe, and it definitely represents the extreme edge of the doctrine. But the underlying principle has to hold.
The principle of threatening people to avoid trials?
The prosecutor's core interest is in persuading the defendant to forego the trial to keep the system moving. That is a legitimate state interest.
It is coercion laundered into policy, and I am not going to let the dissent claim otherwise. Look at the empirical reality. The Department of Justice reports that 95% of state and federal felony convictions are obtained through pleas.
Right, it's a huge majority.
95%. The constitutionally guaranteed trial is practically a statistical anomaly today. And how exactly do we extract those pleas? Through pretrial detention.
Well, bail serves a purpose.
The Vera Institute and numerous independent studies show that if you are held in jail pretrial, your probability of conviction skyrockets, primarily through guilty pleas. Think about the human mechanism here.
You're talking about the pressure of being incarcerated?
Exactly. The state says take this probation offer and go home today, or wait 6 months in a cell for your trial and face a vastly harsher sentence if you lose. Meanwhile, the defendant is losing their job, missing rent, losing custody of their kids.
It's a difficult situation.
That is not a free, knowing, and voluntary constitutional choice. It is survival bargaining.
Listen, I'll grant you that the sheer volume of plea deals, that 95% figure, is a staggering statistic that should give anyone pause. And obviously, no one wants a system where innocent people plead guilty just to go back to their lives.
But that's exactly what we have.
But have you considered the alternative? If you strip away prosecutorial leverage and plea bargaining, the system literally collapses under its own weight tomorrow. We just do not have the judges, the courtrooms, or the tax dollars to take 100% of cases to trial.
Then the system is confessing that it cannot afford the constitutional rights it promises on paper. And rather than fixing it, it is balancing its budget on the backs of the detained and the poor.
It's a matter of practicality.
But that coercion you just described, that survival bargaining, doesn't just end when the ink dries on the plea agreement. It haunts the defendant for the rest of their life.
You're talking about recidivism enhancements now?
Yes, because 5 years later, when they are pulled over again, this system looks at that coerced plea and uses it as a weapon. This is what the essay calls the record multiplier. And it leads us to something I want to introduce, which is the first offense equality rule.
Oh, I know where you were going with this. And it completely cuts against centuries of established common law.
I know what our listeners are probably thinking right now. Wait, are you really saying a person with 10 prior convictions should be treated exactly the same as a kid who made their very first mistake?
Because it cuts against everything we've been taught about common sense.
It does, but here is why equal protection demands exactly that. The rule is simple. Every new charge must be sentence structured as if it were the first offense. The state has the absolute right to prosecute the present act, but it may not enhance the person.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Let me finish the mechanism first. Think about compound interest on a predatory loan. You start with a small, unfair principal, and over time it balloons into massive, unpayable debt.
Okay.
The justice system does the exact same thing. It manufactures a prior record through unequal protection, like bad counsel, an unpayable cash bond, the coercive plea pressures we just talked about.
You're assuming all prior records are invalid.
I'm saying they are tainted. And then years later, the system uses that tainted record to justify harsher, unequal protection in a new case. The machine multiplies its own prior unequal outcomes and calls the multiplication justice.
That's a clever analogy, but it completely ignores why we use prior records in the first place. Recidivist sentencing has an impeccable historical pedigree that predates the founding of the Republic.
History doesn't make it equal.
Repeat offenders present entirely different public safety risks, and the law has to recognize that. The Supreme Court confirmed this in Almendarez-Torres, where they ruled that a prior conviction is merely a sentencing factor.
A historical fact for the judge.
Exactly, not a separate element of a new crime that needs to be proven to a jury. And look at Ewing v. California. The court upheld a 3-strike sentence where a man received 25 years to life for stealing 3 golf clubs.
Which is wildly disproportionate.
But the Eighth Amendment allows legislative judgment on proportionality. Finality is a core legal principle. Those prior convictions you are calling tainted debt went through their own due process, their own appeals.
I completely disagree.
You cannot just erase legal history and pretend a habitual offender is standing in the exact same shoes as a first-time offender.
I am absolutely not yielding the ground on the sanctity of prior records, because what you are doing is laundering substantive inequality through procedural finality.
It's not laundering, it's respecting closed cases.
The fact that a conviction survived an appeals process only proves that the case is legally closed. It does not prove the initial machinery was equal or fair. When a system enhances a current sentence based on past systemic failures, the law is no longer asking what happened this time.
It's asking about the defendant's character.
It is judging the person's status. It creates a legally inferior caste. Even the Supreme Court knows this doctrine is incredibly fragile. Almendarez-Torres was a 5-4 decision, and Justice Thomas later publicly disavowed his own deciding vote.
But the precedent still stands.
Using a prior record for individualized sentencing inside a normal standard range is one thing, but using it to fundamentally rewrite the statutory exposure itself, turning a 5-year max into a life sentence, transforms history into a status that fundamentally strips a person of their equal protection right now.
Let's pull the lens back here for a second, because your entire critique assumes that America operates a single, unified criminal justice system that can be perfectly standardized.
It should be subject to the same constitution.
It doesn't operate that way. We operate thousands of distinct, localized punishment machines. And that is a feature of our republic, not a bug. It is called federalism. The 10th Amendment reserves the general police power to the states.
I'm not arguing against state boundaries.
But you keep pointing to variations in public defense funding, jail conditions, and bail habits as if they are 14th Amendment violations. The ABA's National Public Defense Workload Study might show that defenders in one county carry 500 felonies a year, while in another they carry 50.
That's a massive disparity.
Yes, that is a local policy issue. But resource parity is a legislative choice dictated by local tax bases and state budgets. You are demanding a level of national standardization that violates the foundational compromise of the Constitution itself.
I have to stop you there. I am not going to let you conflate 2 entirely different kinds of variation, and I will never concede that local budgets excuse unequal defensive power against the state.
But the states run the courts.
The 14th Amendment was specifically enacted after the Civil War to constrain state autonomy in this exact domain.
It constrains states from violating federal rights. It doesn't dictate how they allocate their county budgets.
It commands a national constitutional floor for what I call protective architecture. Let's be very clear, I am not arguing against substantive policy variation.
So states can write their own laws?
Absolutely. States can decide what conduct is criminal. Texas can have different speed limits or drug laws than California. That is federalism. But protective architecture, the bond systems, the quality of legal counsel, the physical jail conditions, that is the literal shield placed between the citizen and the sheer force of the state.
But resources aren't infinite.
You cannot look me in the eye and say that if one state gives a defendant a fully funded defense team with investigators and another state gives a defendant a lawyer with 500 cases who meets them for 5 minutes in a hallway, that both of those citizens are receiving equal protection of the laws.
The free market cannot be an excuse for denying constitutional rights.
But again, the Supreme Court has never read the 14th Amendment to require absolute systematic parity in resources. San Antonio v. Rodriguez settled that. The Constitution does not require the state to equalize wealth. And I am arguing that the doctrine has narrowed the plain text of the Constitution to the point of absolute absurdity.
Absurdity is a strong word.
The state cannot divide itself into distinct municipal pieces and say, well, the legislature only wrote the law, the county only underfunded the public defender, and the judge only applied the statute.
They are separate entities.
But the accused citizen experiences all of that combined force as one singular state action. We already see this holistic logic working in other areas. Look at Bearden v. Georgia.
The fines and fees case.
Yes, the Supreme Court explicitly said you cannot imprison someone solely because they are too poor to pay a fine. They looked at the whole picture, the cumulative effect of the fines, the probation rules, and the jail time tied to indigence. Why won't you apply that exact same holistic logic to the rest of the machinery?
Because Bearden dealt with a very specific, discrete deprivation of liberty tied directly to a lack of money. What you are proposing is a roving federal mandate over every single mechanism of state court administration.
It's called enforcing the 14th Amendment.
And let's be honest about where all this architecture actually comes from. It comes from lawmakers, which brings us to the ultimate structural root of the essay's argument. If you were going to claim the downstream criminal procedure is unequal, you eventually have to look upstream at how the lawmakers themselves are selected.
Exactly. Because if the law itself is not equally protected from structural distortion at its source, the people cannot be equally protected by that law downstream.
The upstream argument.
The unequal machinery starts long before a person is ever handcuffed or charged. It starts with the gate into federal legislative power.
Right, and the essay targets the 17th Amendment here, which moved the selection of U.S. senators from state legislatures directly to the popular vote. The argument implies that this violated Article 5's equal suffrage clause.
It fundamentally changed the nature of the Senate.
But I have to push back incredibly hard here. Moving Senate selection to the popular vote did not deprive any state of equal suffrage. It's simple math. Every state still has 2 senators. Every senator has 1 vote.
That's just arithmetic.
And historically speaking, the 17th Amendment was desperately needed to cure real systemic corruption. State legislatures were completely deadlocked. You had the infamous Lorimer bribery scandal, where U.S. Senate seats were literally being bought with cash in smoke-filled rooms. Direct election took it out of the back rooms and democratized the process.
I completely refuse to accept that simplistic arithmetic definition of equal suffrage. Equal suffrage cannot merely mean 2 chairs per state. If the original constitutional design explicitly gave the state legislature the key to deciding who sits in that chair.
But the people vote now. That's a good thing.
By moving Senate selection from an institutional body to a massive statewide popular electorate, the 17th Amendment didn't just change a voting procedure, it transferred the gate of federal power directly into the campaign marketplace.
A marketplace of the people.
A marketplace that requires tens of millions of dollars, media consultants,
algorithmic branding, and absolute saturation to win. Let's look at the campaign finance doctrine we actually operate under. Direct vote buying is illegal. Sure, you can't hand a voter a $100 bill at the ballot box.
Obviously.
But Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United protected massive, unlimited, independent expenditures to shape electoral perception. They ruled that political spending is protected First Amendment speech.
Which it is.
So the system made direct vote buying illegal, but it protected the purchase of the mind around the hand. It allowed endless dark money to purchase the psychological atmosphere in which the voter makes their choice.
But the Supreme Court in Citizens United was exceptionally clear that independent expenditures do not cause the kind of direct quid pro quo corruption that justifies restricting free speech. You're treating the normal democratic process like campaigning, advertising, persuading voters as if it is inherently corrupt.
I am treating it as inherently susceptible to capture by extreme wealth. Let's trace the actual physical mechanism of how this impacts the courtroom. The Constitution says a senator must be an inhabitant of their state when elected, but they serve as a citizen of the United States.
Right.
The senator is supposed to be chosen by the state to enter federal office. But because of the 17th Amendment's popular election structure, a candidate must build a massive, multi-million-dollar political machine funded by national donors and special interests just to win.
That's modern politics. But how does that affect the local courts?
How does a federal Senate campaign affect a guy sitting in a local county jail? Because those federally elected senators use the power of the purse. They write the federal grants that fund local police departments. They tie federal dollars to state-level harsh sentencing laws.
Through legislative action, yes.
And crucially, they are the ones who confirm the federal judges. The very judges who will sit on the bench and rule that a public defender with 500 cases is somehow constitutionally acceptable under the 14th Amendment.
So you are concluding that because senators have to run expensive campaigns, the criminal justice system itself is structurally unconstitutional?
I'm absolutely saying that if the lawmaking body is reached through an unequal influence architecture dominated by massive wealth, then the laws and the judges that body produces downstream are already infected with unequal protection.
That is a massive leap.
The lawmakers write the mandatory minimums. They fund the law enforcement grants. They confirm the appellate judges. If the gate into that body is captured by money and spectacle, then the poor defendant standing in a courtroom isn't just facing a neutral law. They are facing a law produced by a structurally distorted channel. A manipulated constitutional structure upstream inevitably produces manipulated justice downstream.
Well, let me summarize my position, because we have covered immense ground today. From local plea deals to federal elections, the American criminal justice system is incredibly complex. And yes, it has flaws.
Huge flaws.
But the constitutional architecture we have, which is grounded in federalism, prosecutorial discretion, legislative authority, and settled Supreme Court doctrine, is deeply sound. Recidivist enhancements exist to protect public safety from those who repeatedly break the law.
By ignoring the systemic failures that cause the record.
Plea bargaining, while imperfect, allows the system to actually function. Federalism respects the sovereign choices of the states regarding their own local resources and tax burdens. We must firmly warn against redefining equal protection so broadly that it requires an impossible, absolute systemic parity.
It requires actual equality.
If equal protection means every single input, lawyer, and resource must be perfectly identical from county to county, the system will completely paralyze itself. Current doctrine correctly limits the scope to preventing arbitrary, facial discrimination, leaving structural variations to the democratic process.
And I will reassert my steadfast position. Equal protection is entirely meaningless if every constituent part of the system is inherently unequal. From the upstream lawmaking captured by campaign finance to the downstream plea pressures driven by pretrial detention and unpayable bail.
It's a very broad net you're casting.
From the massively underfunded public defenders to the record multiplier that punishes a person for prior systemic failures. Every link in the chain is broken. The fact that the Supreme Court currently permits this massive gap between the constitutional text and the operational reality is an indictment of the doctrine, not an excuse for the harm.
It's a debate about what is practically possible.
We cannot look a citizen in the eye and call it equal protection when the machinery itself alters its output based on the wealth, status, and geography of the accused.
It is a profound tension. We are looking at the realities of human institutions, how courts actually operate day to day, versus the pure ideals of constitutional theory.
Exactly.
There is so much more to explore in Zachary David Enfield's material regarding the exact mechanics of these systems. But the debate between settled law and holistic justice is one that won't be resolved easily.
It won't. And we will leave it to the listener to weigh these perspectives and examine the evidence. But think back to that industrial machine we started with.
The assembly line?
Right. We want to desperately believe our justice system is an assembly line of truth, steady, uniform, and completely blind to influence. But when you look closely at the gears, when you see how the system actually processes human beings, you have to ask yourself, is the machine actually broken, or is it working exactly as it was built to? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.